Well, I was making these poured pieces that were, like I'd work on them on the floor, and I'd take polyurethane and dry pigment and some dispersion, which was like a watered down pigment, and disperse it in the polyurethane, and then make these poured pieces that would sort of like seal themselves and define themselves once I had sort of, once I had sort of like made the initial configuration. And I was working with a knot imagery in the pores, so I would pour in the configuration of a knot, like into a sort of like a puddle that was sort of setting up, and so it would sort of drift and dry according to its own, its own drying time and whatever variables I had sort of played around with. And so I was working in that vein for a while, and sort of, for various reasons, the knot imagery, had developed from these large macrame pieces that I had been making, and it sort of, the imagery of the knot itself sort of found its way into the paintings. And then I spent about a year trying to really make a drawing, like a drawing that was not a scaled down version of the paintings, and that was, sort of dealing with the materiality of like paper and gouache or watercolor and pencil, dealing with the materiality in the same way that I was dealing with materiality in paintings. Up until that point, I think that I was sort of like, I was just bringing the materials of a painting to the drawings. And so, I really, it was like a real project. I just really wanted to be able to accomplish this on paper. And so, so for about 2 years, I really, went down that road of working on paper, and it really changed the work. I mean, what happened was the imagery of the painting sort of got fleshed out in a reverse kind of way, where like, before I was sort of like, sort of like configuring the imagery of the knots, out of like midair, or out of nothing. It was sort of like, instead the drawings were sort of like being, fleshed out from the inside out. So anyway, and that sort of led to the sculptures, which are like also the knot configurations. And so they're almost, they sort of like recall the earlier paintings in a sense, because they're much more linear in a way than the drawings are. So so there's sort of been this like, this real dialogue back and forth between, the drawing and the sculpture, and the painting and the sculpture, and the painting and the drawing. And basically from that point, the drawings also, I got to this point where I was sort of making these images on a piece of paper, and the knots really lent themselves to, creating something that wasn't, that wasn't composed. It was important that there was not this sort of, composed aspect to them. They sort of like were, in a sense, still defining the edge, their own edge, by the nature of, the knot configuration. So they were sort of these isolated images on a piece of paper, where I then had like the edge of the drawing, and then the edge of the paper itself. And so that that sort of brought me to paint these pieces directly onto the wall, where in a sense the edge of the drawing would be the edge of the piece, and there wouldn't be this edge of the paper to sort of deal with and negotiate. So that's how the wall drawings came about. And so that's basically the point that I'm at now, is sort of still working on the poured piece paintings on canvas and making these sculptures and the wall drawings and the pieces on paper. So it's sort of like all coalescing in terms of this, you know, sort of around this one, you know, set of images. I mean, they sort of like, you know, propagate, you know, you know, they sort of generate and, you know, spawn themselves.
Kissing their own hands. There's 666 on the kitchen floor. There ain't no fire in the pan. I get lonesome. I get lonesome. I get lonesome. To be a slab, stiff as a stick on a board. I get thoughts and dirty socks piled in the corner. I get lonesome. I get lonesome. I get lonesome.
The reason that I've been, you know, sort of pursuing this not imagery is really, it really comes out of this idea or this sort of interest in craft. I don't want to like elevate craft. It really comes out of like a way of working that interests me. I'm interested in the way that like someone can like knit, you know, or crochet an Afghan and sort of like have a meditative kind of like methodology, like a way of working that brings a sort of like a particular type of experience to that way of working of all of this work. The aspect of chaos and control is really, you know, a large part of it because I sort of, well, what I started out with was, you know, using a wax material, just sort of an encaustic type of material to sort of, you know, like submerge these elements in the paintings. And what I, you know, what I did was I stepped away from that by using polyurethane. And so, and the polyurethane was a material that, you know, was really, when you're pouring it on this sort of, you know, on this horizontal surface, there's really, you know, it really takes on its own, you know, there's a large degree of chaos involved with that because you sort of, you know, you can sort of tweak the drawing time, and that's a big part of why I used a lot of dry pigment. That's why I pursued that for a long time, is because I could really, you know, have an aspect of control over, you know, like how fast things would dry, and, you know, or, you know, you re-loosen a surface that had already set up by, you know, introducing another pour of wet urethane to it, and that was sort of using those various, you know, viscosities of polyurethane was a way that I sort of like introduced control into this, you know, sort of, you know, chaotic way of making something, and so it almost became its own subject matter. If these pieces are engaged in language at all, it's about a sort of guttural kind of pre-language, a state before language, is sort of like forming. And so, and there's that's sort of why they have their sort of like hands-on look. I mean, I think that there are a lot of artists who are really interested in process and materiality, and who are dealing with language, developing language, a particular language in their work. And I guess, if anything, these are about, you know, a state prior to that formation, that, you know, I guess, you know, guttural is the word that I really, that springs to mind. A lot of what I've been thinking about lately is, you know, this, you know, like going back, sort of going back to the experience of like when I was first making things, and how that is this really sort of open experience of, you know, you sort of like don't have the same kind of vested interest in sort of, you know, in the outcome. So you're sort of like following along with the experience, and the outcome is sort of, you know, in a sense secondary. The outcome for me now is, you know, really, you know, of course important, but I'm interested in that state, in that way of working, and sort of, you know, after, you know, education, and after, you know, many years of, you know, working and developing language and thinking about language, sort of going back to a time or a state when you could sort of make things very open-endedly and immediately and unaffectedly. And then even further back to a time when, you know, I guess artwork or making objects was not the issue at all, but those kinds of experiences that are, you know, really about play and experience. And there was this one thing that I used to do with my best friend in kindergarten, and that was to, you know, like take buckets of water and pour them down this sort of like small hill in her yard, and sort of erode the surface, and sort of like build up parts of it, and like, you know, create little dams, and, you know, like this sort of like, you know, mini microcosm. And, you know, and all through the summer we'd like go back and, you know, sort of, you know, mess up, you know, her lawn. And so, and that was sort of like, you know, that in terms of an experience, that sort of like continued effort, that sort of creating a place for the mind or the imagination is, you know, it's still present, or you know, for me, it's like what I need to sort of, you know, it's what interests me about making things still, that sort of state. And then I guess if you could even go back further until, you know, to this idea of the, you know, or the state of the prelingual or the infantile. I guess, you know, when you talk about things sort of being, you know, before a language, you immediately think of, you know, babies. And I guess, you know, I guess that has its therapeutic aspects. Although I think that, you know, it's important to, you know, think of the outcome. But that state is a place you can go and sort of, you know, re-experience it, and there is an immediacy about it. There is, you know, there is this thing about perception that is really interesting. You know, with babies, I mean, I saw this really interesting thing about where you know, babies, when they're held, or when they see things in the world, or when you know, that there's actually a physiological connection that gets made, and it's almost like the tying of a knot. It's really incredible. There's this amazing footage of these like sort of fibrous cells sort of reaching out magnetically toward one another, and sort of like, you know, tying up, making a connection. And so the way that we perceive, the way that we you know, is really like the tying of a knot. It's like, it's making that connection. When I make these things, it's, like I believe that like the body has memory. And so when, you know, when you think of the idea of sort of bringing everything that you know about art to the making of a piece of artwork, it's sort of, it kind of in a sense has to be there. I mean, because it's like, you know, if you've made a perceptual connection in the way that, you know, it's like actually exists physically in the brain, you know, I think, and this sort of goes back to the concept of the prelingual, is that it exists there, it's part of you physically, and so you can't help but bring, you know, everything you know, and you know, in all of your experiences, the whole package sort of comes with you, and I guess that's in a sense why, you know, the drawings, when they sort of made their way from the paper to the wall, was, you know, there's a connection there for me, because they sort of existed in an environment that was, they were like part of an environment, and they also created an environment, and they also worked in a mirror-like way with the sculptures, sort of, you know, sort of like a reversal or a reflection in reverse, in a sense, to the sculptures. And so that sense of like creating a space or an environment, or like an environment where you physically interact. You know, it's almost like that. You know, being in my friend's yard and sort of creating, you know, like this sort of mini earthwork. It really becomes about like the body and the physical, and you know, and there is this level of, you know, of altering the environment, or you know, or creating a scenario that sort of mirrors also the, you know, the physical aspect of, you know, making a connection in the brain. So I think that, you know, that is part of why I wanted to sort of bring the drawings out of this sort of more pictorial kind of environment, and sort of have them stand on their own in that way. I'm still getting at the big project, you know, that I'm still formulating, maybe almost in a guttural way, you know, what that means to me. I mean, it's sort of, you know, I see the work as sort of like, you know, really at this place where it's like really reaching out and you know, finding its footing. You know, not that I feel like I'm, you know, taking my first steps in a sense, but you know, that it's, in terms of the big picture, you know, what, you know, the big meaning is, it's really like, you know, still finding its way. It's sort of, you know, it's almost like a physical groping, you know, in the dark. There's almost like this aspect of like blindness about it, because there's, you know, even though it's, you know, so obviously visual, you know, project, there is this aspect of blindness to it, of sort of, and I guess that's part of when you decide to work open-endedly. That's a part of it. That's part of the challenge that goes along with that, and that has been present. That idea of blindness has been present in the work. I think for a while there was this one announcement that I did for a show a few years back. It took this quote from The Voyage of the Beagle by Darwin, and it was about these missionaries who go off and are exploring the Antarctic, and you know, it's like the description is like this big whiteout, you know, it's like you know, like just this frozen whiteout. And they're on this boat called the Wager, which seems like really like tempting fate to me, to like name a, you know, a boat, you know, after sort of like, you know, this chance, you know, a bet like you know, I hope we make it back on the Wager, you know. So, but they don't. There's this one story about these missionaries who go off and they find this, you know, never before seen by man channel, you know, in the Antarctic. And, you know, it's just like the absurdity of that, of these people who've like kind of gone off with this like agenda, you know, this like, you know, oh, well, you know, these people that we're going to convert, and, you know, like in the end being, you know, like consumed when like a huge cataract splashes down into the water and like consumes the boat. So it's there's that level of, you know, absurdity that, you know, I'm interested in, and that's sort of like going out, you know, and not really knowing where you're going to end up. Gesture, I guess, what happened was the paintings that I was sort of actually making with a brush before, it was, the gestures were really sort of like these isolated, frozen images of gesture, as opposed to, they were really like dislocated, and they're sort of like coming through, you know, the painting, sort of like coming out toward you, as opposed to this like submerged aspect of gesture that was sort of like unhinged from its you know, traditional meaning in terms of you know, like historic abstract expressionism, where the gesture became this sort of like seismographic you know, mark that, you know, was sort of like the artist was like almost like a seismographic, you know, apparatus, you know, like that sort of like registered the vibrations of like, you know, like transcendence or like the soul or whatever, and that you kind of, as a viewer, sort of like would, it sort of placed the artist in this sort of like really heroic position of being, you know, someone who's really like in tune with that kind of state. And so when I started to make the poured pieces, they really became a gesture that was sort of enclosed in and of itself. And so they, it was really a way of getting away from that. Well, when I was making the macrame pieces, I needed some help from how-to books in order to like actually make them, because you know, I didn't have a whole you know, skill at my fingertips for that. And so it was really, you know, the books themselves became this really great thing, and now I still use them as you know, source material for the knots. So in a sense, the little photographs of, you know, knotted string on, you know, in these how-to books, and, you know, how to, you know, make macrame, or, you know, some of them are like how to create sailor's knots, and you know, they really are the sort of skeleton for the sculptures in a way, and so you know, the how-to books, these have really become sort of an important source material for the work, and that's another way that like the early macrame pieces sort of you know, is still, you know, it's like sort of the legacy of those earlier sculptures.
Well, there ain't nobody left to impress, and everyone's kissing their own hands. There's 666 on the kitchen floor, but ain't no fire in the pan. I get lonesome, I get lonesome, I get lonesome. I stumble